There are nights when sleep doesn't bring rest. It brings visitors. Last night, I dreamed of a man sitting by a dying fire. His face was weathered, carved by years of impossible decisions. His eyes were tired but sharp, eyes that had seen death, betrayal, and the edge of collapse. He wore no crown, no monument, just the weight of 1,000 choices that could have broken him. When he looked at me, I knew him instantly, not from paintings or textbooks, but from something deeper, something that felt like recognition across time. George Washington. And he didn't speak like a legend. He spoke like a man who had bled, failed, and barely survived. "You think I was born for this?" he said quietly, staring into the embers. "You think I always knew the way forward?" I said nothing. Couldn't. "I didn't," he continued, his voice low and heavy. "Most days I was drowning. Most days I wanted to quit." The fire crackled between us. The silence stretched. And then he began to speak. Not about glory, but about pain. Not about triumph, but about survival. The setting wasn't grand. No marbelols. No monuments or battlefields frozen in time. Just a simple wooden cabin, dimly lit by a single candle flickering on a rough-hewn table. The air smelled of smoke and old leather, of earth and exhaustion. The walls were bare except for a single map, creased and worn, pinned crookedly to the wood. George Washington sat across from me, his hands folded on the table. His posture was heavy, bent slightly forward as if the weight of his own memories pressed down on his shoulders. He looked older than I expected, not physically, but in his eyes. There was a weariness there that no painting had ever captured. "Do you know what it's like," he began slowly, "to carry the hope of thousands when you can barely carry yourself?" I shook my head. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with bitter recognition. The kind of smile that comes from knowing a truth too well. "Then let me tell you," he said, "not about glory, not about the statues or the speeches. Let me tell you about the parts they don't put in books, the parts they don't teach children, the parts one lived through when no one was watching." And so he did. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he said, his voice steady but sad. "I wasn't born into power or privilege. Not the kind that mattered, anyway. My family had land, yes, but we were Virginia gentry at best. Respectable, but not remarkable. And then my father died when I was 11. 11 years old." He paused, his jaw tightening as the memory surfaced. "Just like that, any plans for my education, my future, they vanished. My older brothers went to England for proper schooling. I stayed behind. I watched my mother struggle to keep our estate together. I watched her work herself to exhaustion. I learned early that the world doesn't hand you anything. Not respect, not opportunity, not a future. You claw for it, or you disappear into obscurity." Washington's hands clenched slightly. "I wanted to be somebody. I didn't know who. I didn't know how. But I wanted to matter. So I did what I could. I became a surveyor. 16 years old, measuring other men's land while dreaming of my own. I walked through wilderness for weeks at a time. I slept in the rain. I ate whatever I could find. I earned just enough to survive, and I saved every penny I could." He looked at me directly, his gaze piercing. "That's where it starts. Not with vision, not with some grand calling, with desperation, with a boy who didn't want to be forgotten. I thought the military would be my path," he continued, his voice growing darker. "I joined the Virginia militia at 21. I thought I'd prove myself. I thought I'd earn the respect I craved, the recognition I'd been chasing since my father died." His expression shifted, something between anger and shame. "Instead, I tasted failure so bitter it still haunts me." Washington leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, staring at something I couldn't see. "The French and Indian War. I was sent on a mission to deliver a message to the French forces encroaching on British territory. It seemed simple enough, diplomatic, straightforward, but it turned into a disaster." He shook his head slowly. "We got ambushed. Men died under my command. Good men, boys really, who trusted me. And I was 22 years old, inexperienced, terrified. I made mistakes, bad ones. I didn't know how to read the terrain. I didn't know how to anticipate the enemy. I didn't know anything. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Then came fort necessity. I built a fort in a swamp because I didn't know better. The French surrounded us. We were outnumbered, outgunned, soaking wet, running out of ammunition. I had to surrender. Me, George Washington. I had to raise the white flag. He laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. And then I signed a document I didn't fully understand. It was written in French, and my translator was incompetent or a liar. I never knew which. Later, I found out it made me confess to assassinating a French diplomat. An assassination I didn't commit. He looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Raw, unguarded pain. I was humiliated. My reputation was ruined before it even began. The British officers mocked me, called me incompetent, reckless, a colonial fool playing at war. And they were right. I went home in shame, convinced I'd never lead anyone again. Convinced I'd failed at the only thing I thought I could do. I stepped away from the military, Washington said, his voice quieter now. I married Martha. She was a widow with 2 children, and she brought stability, wealth, a chance at a different life. I inherited Mount Vernon when my brother died. I became a planter. For years, I tried to build something stable. A farm, a life, a legacy that didn't involve war or politics. He gestured as if the weight of it still sat on his shoulders. But even that was a struggle. Tobacco farming nearly bankrupted me. The British merchants controlled the prices, controlled the trade, controlled everything. I was in debt constantly, no matter how hard I worked. I managed hundreds of slaves, something I grew increasingly uncomfortable with as the years passed, though I didn't know how to escape the system I was born into. I felt trapped by my own life. His voice grew even softer. And through it all, there was this gnawing doubt, this voice in my head that never stopped. It said, "You're not special. You're not destined for anything. You failed as a soldier. You're failing as a farmer. You're just a man with debts and dirt under his nails, pretending to be more than you are." He looked at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Do you know that voice?" I nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then you'll understand what came next. When the revolution began," Washington said, standing up now, his movements slow and deliberate, "I didn't want the job. I swear to you I didn't." The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. They were choosing a commander for the Continental Army, and everyone kept looking at me. He paced to the window, staring out into darkness. I sat there thinking, I failed in the French and Indian War. I barely held my farm together. I have no experience commanding a large army. Why would I be the one to lead a revolution against the most powerful empire on earth? He turned back to me, but I said yes, not because I was confident, not because I thought I could win. I said yes because no one else would, because all the other men in that room had reasons to say no, and I couldn't live with myself if I was just another one of them. Saying no felt like cowardice. So I said yes. He sat back down, his shoulders sagging. I took command of an army that barely existed. Farmers and shopkeepers with hunting rifles. Boys who'd never fired a shot in anger. No uniformes, no discipline, no supplies. And we were supposed to fight the British Empire, the greatest military force the world had ever seen. He looked at me with something close to desperation. I wanted to run. Every single day I wanted to run. The first battles were disasters, Washington said. We fought in New York. I thought we could hold the city. I thought we could make a stand. He shook his head. We got crushed. The British had professional soldiers, naval support, superior tactics. We had chaos. I lost battle after battle. Brooklyn Heights, Kips Bay, White Plains, Fort Washington. I lost an entire garrison there. Over 2,000 men captured in a single day. His voice cracked slightly. I retreated. Again and again. We ran across New Jersey with the British chasing us. My army was falling apart. Men were deserting by the hundreds. They were hungry, exhausted, dying of disease, and I couldn't blame them. I had led them into a nightmare. He paused, collecting himself. Congress fled Philadelphia. They thought the war was over. Some of my own generals started questioning whether I should remain in command. And I sat in my tent at night, reading letters from men who told me I was incompetent, that I was losing the war, that I should resign. He looked at me, and they were right. I was losing. Valley Forge, he said, and his entire body seemed to tense. That winter of 1777 into 1778. You've heard of it, I'm sure. They teach it in schools. They call it the turning point. But you don't know it. You can't. He sat back down, and for the first time I saw his hands trembling. We had lost Philadelphia, the capital. We were retreating again, broken and defeated. My men had no shoes, no coats. They wrapped their feet in rags torn from their own clothing, and their blood stained the snow as we marched. I can still see those trails of red in the white. He closed his eyes. We made camp at Valley Forge, 12,000 men. We had no food, no blankets, no medicine, no gunpowder. We built huts out of logs and mud, but they barely kept out the cold. Men were dying of frostbite, of starvation, of typhoid and dysentery. His voice broke. I walked through the camp at night and saw them. Boys, really 17, 18 years old, shivering around fires that barely gave warmth. Some were crying. Some had given up, just lying there waiting to die. And I had to stand there and tell them we'd keep fighting. I had to lie and say I believed we'd win. A long, terrible silence. I didn't believe it. Not then. I thought we'd all die in that snow. I thought the revolution would end not with a battle, but with a slow, frozen death that no one would remember. There were so many moments, Washington said, his voice barely above a whisper now, where I almost walked away after every loss, and there were so many. I wrote letters to Congress begging for support, for supplies, for reinforcements. They sent nothing. They had no money, no power. They were as helpless as I was. He rubbed his face with both hands. After every betrayal, and there were those too, I wondered if it was worth it. Some of my own officers plotted against me. The Conway Cabal, they called it. Men I had trusted whispered that I was incompetent, that someone else should lead, that maybe Gates or Lee could do better. He looked at me with raw honesty. And maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I was just a failed surveyor and planter playing at being a general. He leaned forward. But I stayed. Not because I was strong. Not because I was brave. I stayed because I was stubborn. Because the men who stayed, the ones who didn't desert, who didn't give up, they deserved a leader who wouldn't abandon them. Even if that leader was failing. Hashtag the small victories. Trenton, Washington said, and for the first time, a hint of light entered his eyes. Christmas night, 1776. We crossed the Delaware River in a storm. Ice in the water, men freezing, boats nearly capsizing. It was insane. He smiled faintly, but we caught the Hessians by surprise. We won. It was small, but it was something. It gave the men hope. It gave me hope. He paused. Then Princeton. Another victory. Small again, but enough to keep us alive. Enough to keep the revolution breathing. Yorktown, he said, the light in his eyes growing brighter. 1781. We had the French Navy finally committed. We had Rochambeau's troops. We cornered Cornwallis at Yorktown, trapped him between our army and the French fleet. He smiled just barely. For the first time in years, I felt something close to hope. Real hope. When the British surrendered, when Cornwallis sent out his deputy because he was too ashamed to face me himself, I didn't celebrate. I just felt relief, like I could finally breathe after drowning for 6 years. He paused, and the smile faded. But even then, I knew the hardest part wasn't over. Hashtag the weight of peace. After the war, I wanted to go home, Washington said. I wanted to be done. I resigned my commission to Congress. I went back to Mount Vernon. I wanted to live quietly, to farm, to fade into a peaceful life. He sighed deeply. But the country was falling apart. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. States were fighting each other. There was no real government, no unity. The country I'd fought for was collapsing before it even began. He looked tired again. They asked me to lead the Constitutional Convention. Then they asked me to be president. And again, I didn't want it. I was 57 years old. I was exhausted. My body hurt. My teeth were falling out. I was ready to rest. He looked at me, but I said yes, because someone had to, because duty doesn't care if you're tired. Being president, he said slowly, was harder than war. In war, the enemy is clear. In peace, everyone is an enemy. Hamilton and Jefferson fought constantly. The Federalists and the Republicans tore at each other. Every decision I made, half the country hated me for it. He shook his head. I served 2 terms, 8 years, and by the end I was done. I gave my farewell address and I warned them. I warned them about political parties, about foreign entanglements, about losing sight of unity. I don't know if anyone listened. Washington stood up, his presence filling the small room despite his exhaustion. "You want to know how I found courage in doubt?" he asked, his voice firm now. "I didn't. I never stopped doubting. I doubted myself every single day of my life. Every decision, every battle, every speech." He stepped closer. "But I learned something. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's not confidence or certainty. Courage is doing what must be done even when you're terrified, even when you're failing, even when every part of you wants to quit." His voice grew intense. "You don't wait for doubt to disappear. It never will. You carry it with you. You let it make you humble. You let it make you careful. You let it remind you that you're human. But you don't let it stop you." He placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of it. The world needs people who move forward despite the fear, despite the doubt, despite the failures. That's what leadership is. That's what courage is. Not perfection. Endurance. I woke up with tears on my face, my heart pounding. The dream felt more real than my own memories. George Washington, the man, not the myth, not the statue, not the dollar bill, had sat with me in that cabin and shared his pain, his failures, his doubts, his humanity, and somehow, in all of that brokenness, I saw something I hadn't expected. Hope, not the kind that ignores suffering, not toxic positivity or empty platitudes, the kind that endures through suffering, the kind that says, "I don't know if I can do this, but I'll try anyway." George Washington didn't succeed because he was fearless. He succeeded because he refused to quit when fear consumed him. He didn't have all the answers. He made terrible mistakes. He failed publicly, repeatedly. He nearly lost everything multiple times. But he kept moving forward. He carried the weight of impossible responsibility not because he was strong enough, but because he chose to keep carrying it anyway, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one step at a time. That's the real lesson from that dream. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to keep going even when everything in you wants to stop. If you're reading this and you feel lost, if you're drowning in doubt, if you failed, if you're not sure you have what it takes, I need you to hear this. You're not alone. George Washington felt that way too. The father of a nation. The man on the dollar bill. The legend. He felt like a failure. He wanted to quit. He doubted himself constantly. And he still became who he became. Not because he was born great, because he endured. So can you? Keep going. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The world needs people who refuse to quit. Your story isn't over.